Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of the Little Ice Age, Iroquois versus Huron. It began in the hush of a frozen dawn, not with a battle cry, but with the brittle crack of river ice, splitting under a warrior's careful step. Thick fog clung low to the forests of the Canadian Shield, clinging to the bark of ancient pines like breath on glass. A stillness hung in the air, heavy with waiting. Beneath it, dozens of shadows crept silently through snow-laden undergrowth, their feet wrapped in deerskin, their faces streaked with soot. These were the warriors of the Iroquois Confederacy, moving like ghosts across a frozen frontier, closing in on their ancestral rivals. This was not a war fought for empires, or flags, or thrones. This was a war for survival, born in the grip of a dying climate. In the 1600s, long before the American Revolution or the founding of Canada, the forests and lakes of the Northeast were torn apart by a conflict every bit as brutal and decisive as any European war. This was the Beaver Wars, or as some call them, the Iroquois Wars. But beneath that dry title lies something much more primal, a war of attrition and annihilation between the Iroquois Confederacy and their long-standing enemies, the Huron-Wendat. To understand the bloodshed, you have to understand the time. The 17th century was the heart of the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long period of colder temperatures that devastated crops, strained resources, and turned the forests of the Northeast into unforgiving battlefields. Food grew scarce. The rivers froze longer. Even the Great Lakes turned to slabs of ice in winter. For the indigenous nations of North America, this was not a passing chill. It was a slow death by famine, frost, and plague. Then came the Europeans. The French had arrived in Huron territory first. Jesuit priests and traders carrying iron tools, steel blades, and disease. In return for furs, they offered arquebuses, early black powder firearms, and protection from their enemies to the south, the Iroquois. It was a strategic alliance and a fragile one. The Huron traded beaver pelts for muskets and missionaries. The French needed the trade to survive. The Huron needed the guns to live. The Iroquois, meanwhile, had made their own arrangements with the Dutch and later the English. The Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Seneca, the Cayuga, and the Oneida, the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee League, forged their own trade routes south to the Hudson and east to the Atlantic. They sought steel, powder, and cloth, not conversion. And as European demand for beaver fur exploded, the forests became a currency exchange, soaked in blood. Beaver pelts meant wealth, wealth meant power, and power meant survival. In the winter of 1648, the Iroquois struck with chilling precision. They knew the Hurons were stretched thin, weakened by years of disease and burdened by Jesuit outposts scattered across the forest, like dying embers. Huron warriors had grown accustomed to defending fixed positions, villages built of wooden palisades, clustered near rivers and trading stations. These were not nomadic raiders like the Iroquois. They were settlers, builders. They were vulnerable. What followed was a campaign of calculated terror. The Iroquois used the winter as their shield, crossing frozen lakes and snow-covered trails that no enemy expected them to use. They struck not just at warriors, but at civilians, women, children, elders, even priests. They burned crops, toppled longhouses, and took captives by the dozen, not just to kill, but to adopt, to replace, to terrorize. One Jesuit missionary wrote of the raids in a letter smuggled south. We have seen villages go up in flame, while the people within cried for mercy in languages their enemies would not hear. The sky is red with sorrow. These were not pitched battles in open fields. They were ambushes, raids, night fires, the clash of steel against bone in darkened clearings where no witness would ever walk again. At the heart of this storm stood two very different visions of warfare. The Huron had adopted many of the French ways, including their firearms, but they still fought in traditional styles, forming defensive circles, protecting their villages, guarding food stores and ceremonial sites. Their warriors wore painted tunics, war clubs at their sides, with tomahawks and flint knives passed from father to son. The Iroquois, by contrast, had refined their raiding tactics into a brutal science. They moved in small, silent groups. They used decoys to draw warriors into traps. They wielded muskets traded from the Dutch, short-barreled, inaccurate but devastating at close range. A thunderclap, followed by smoke, then silence. The Iroquois were masters of psychological warfare. They understood fear, how to plant it, how to harvest it. Their warriors would sometimes let captives escape, just to carry tales of horror home. They used fire and dismemberment, not out of cruelty alone, but as a weapon of morale. And in the frozen forests of Ontario, morale could kill faster than steel. One village, Teanaostaiaé, stood as a symbol of Huron resistance. Perched on a bluff above the Nottawasaga River, it had withstood multiple raids, its walls reinforced with sharpened stakes and watchtowers. Jesuits lived among the people there, translating scripture into Wendat, chronicling their customs and ringing a small iron bell for Mass each morning. In March 1649, the bell fell silent. An Iroquois war band, some 200 strong, descended from the trees before dawn. They came without drums, without calls, without warning. Muskets flared in the snowlight. The palisades were set ablaze with pitch-soaked torches, and as the smoke choked the morning air, the village fell into chaos. Survivors spoke of screams rising over the bell tower, of warriors trying to hold the gate while flames poured over them, of Jesuits standing with crucifixes in hand, refusing to flee. Father Jean de Brébeuf was among them, captured, tortured, and eventually martyred in a manner too horrific to repeat aloud. The Iroquois saw him as a symbol of foreign contamination, the priest who had turned warriors into farmers. His death, and that of Father Gabriel Lalemant, soon after, would become legend, canonized in Europe, but mourned in the ashes of the Huron heartland. The loss of Teanaostaiaé sent shockwaves across the region. Within weeks, other villages began to fall, one by one, like branches snapping under the weight of snow. The Iroquois pressed their advantage, hunting down survivors, destroying food caches, and torching every trace of resistance. They moved like wolves, fast and ruthless. The Huron Confederacy, already reeling from smallpox and famine, began to unravel. Some bands fled west, seeking refuge with the Anishinaabe. Others went north, toward the cold embrace of the Canadian Shield. And still others surrendered, hoping to be absorbed into Iroquois society rather than face extinction. It was not just a defeat, it was a cultural collapse. Within the space of 2 winters, the Huron Confederacy, once one of the largest and most organized nations in the Northeast, ceased to exist as a political entity. A people scattered, their homes razed, their spirits scarred. Their oral histories speak not of conquest, but of heartbreak, of families torn apart, of sacred fires extinguished, of names forgotten in the snow. And the Iroquois? They did not gloat. To them this was not cruelty. It was renewal. The taking of captives, the destruction of rivals, these were traditions as old as the Longhouse. In a time of climate strain and vanishing game, survival required ruthless clarity. War was not personal, it was necessary. But even so, something had changed. The forests no longer echoed with laughter. Smoke still clung to the trunks of dead trees, and across the Great Lakes, the balance of power had shifted forever. The Iroquois had proven themselves unstoppable, but they had also awakened a sleeping world, a world of European empires who now saw in the north not wilderness, but real estate. The smoke had barely cleared from the wreckage of Huron country when the Iroquois turned their gaze westward. They did not rest. They could not afford to. The collapse of the Huron Confederacy had created a vacuum, and in the bitter winds of the Little Ice Age, empty land was never truly empty. Other nations, other alliances, other claimants stirred in the frozen stillness. And so the Iroquois moved again, swift, deliberate, cold as the lakes they crossed. This time the war would not be waged only in the shadows. It would collide head-on with another kind of power, the gunpowder empire of France. To the Iroquois, the French were a riddle. They came bearing steel and gunpowder, but also rosaries and parchment. Their speech was strange, their gods stranger. They built mission forts and called them New France, as if naming something made it theirs. But they bled like any man, and they feared the woods. At first the French tried diplomacy. They had little choice. Their entire foothold in the New World depended on fragile partnerships, especially with the Algonquin and Montagnais, who traded furs down the Ottawa River and kept the French alive through long winters. But the Iroquois saw these alliances as provocations. Why should one people have exclusive access to guns and markets while others were choked off? Why should the Hurons, now broken and scattered, be avenged by foreigners with ships and priests? The Iroquois would challenge this imbalance the only way they knew how, by fire and by blade. In the spring of 1650, war bands set out along the ancient canoe routes that threaded through the Great Lakes like veins. They paddled north toward the Algonquin, who had welcomed fleeing Huron survivors. They struck trading convoys along the Ottawa River, burned storehouses and ambushed isolated mission outposts. But they didn't just strike native villages anymore. They struck forts, French ones. At Trois-Rivières, settlers woke to find smoke drifting up from the trees, black shapes darting between the pines. The Iroquois didn't linger. A flash of musket fire, a handful of scalps, and gone. But the message was clear. Nowhere was safe, not anymore. And in Quebec, that message echoed through stone halls, built to mimic Paris. The French crown had to act. This wasn't just a frontier skirmish now, this was a war. But France did not send an army. They sent more priests, more traders, and a few scattered soldiers, troops de la marine, underpaid and underfed, wearing blue-grey wool and carrying matchlocks that fouled in the rain. Some had never seen snow before. Fewer had ever fought an enemy they couldn't see. Their job was not conquest. It was protection. Build alliances. Guard supply lines. Keep the fur flowing east. That meant fortifying key settlements like Montreal, Tadoussac and Ville-Marie. Small garrisons, palisades, gun loops. A line of wooden teeth trying to bite back the dark. But the Iroquois were not impressed by walls. They had spent generations perfecting how to slip past them. By 1651, raids had become relentless. Entire French trading expeditions vanished. Canoes were found drifting empty, their contents spilled, paddles floating in silence. Homesteads were torched, settlers taken or killed. Jesuit journals from the time speak in increasingly desperate tones, not just of loss, but of confusion. "We do not know how they come or from where," one priest wrote. "We bury what remains, and we do not ask too many questions. The wilderness does not answer. The fear became corrosive. French settlers began abandoning isolated farms and moving behind walls. Trade suffered. Crops rotted in fields. The Jesuits preached courage, but even they wondered how many more converts could be made if every mission ended in blood. The Iroquois, meanwhile, thrived. Their warriors grew bolder, their raids more distant. They began to send scouts west, beyond the Hurons' former range, to the lands of the Petun, the Neutral, and even the Ojibwe. Every new enemy was a potential source of captives. Every village, another fuel source for the fire. They were building something, not an empire in the European sense, no thrones, no coin, no crown, but a dominion of fear, a network of tribute and terror stretching across the woods. And it worked. Yet something else had awakened too. The French might not have sent an army, but someone else had. A new kind of soldier. In 1665, 20 years into this unrelenting shadow war, the King of France finally dispatched the Carignan-Salieres regiment, nearly 1,200 professional troops, battle-hardened from campaigns in Europe. They wore gleaming breastplates, carried flintlock muskets, and marched in step. To the Iroquois, they were unlike anything they had ever faced. These were not lightly armed traders or fragile priests. These were men trained to kill, and built to hold ground. The French wasted no time. They began constructing a chain of forts along the Richelieu River. Fort Richelieu, Fort Chambly, Fort Sainte-Thérèse. Each was a dagger aimed south, toward Mohawk country. Each one manned and supplied year-round. And for the first time, the Iroquois were forced to adapt. Direct assaults failed. The forts held. Muskets cut down charging warriors long before they reached the walls. French patrols scoured the countryside. Villages that had once been raided with impunity now bristled with steel. The tide was turning. In 1666, the French struck back. Governor Daniel de Remy de Courcelles, flanked by over 1,000 men, launched a winter expedition deep into Iroquois territory. An audacious march through snow and forest, aimed straight at the Mohawk heartland. The aim was not total conquest, but shock, a show of force that would unsettle the balance of fear. And it worked. Villages were abandoned ahead of the French advance. Crops burned, longhouses emptied, the Mohawks scattered rather than fight head-on. The French declared victory, though few battles had been fought. But behind that paper triumph lay something more important, a shift in perception. For the first time in decades, the Iroquois were not predators, but prey. Still, the Haudenosaunee were far from defeated. They retreated, regrouped, and reassessed. The Confederacy had always prized adaptability. They knew when to fight and when to speak. And so, after years of blood, emissaries were sent, not to surrender, not to plead, but to negotiate. In 1667, the Iroquois and the French signed a treaty, tentative, conditional, but real. Hostilities paused, trade resumed, Jesuits returned to Iroquois villages, now as guests rather than targets. The forests exhaled. For a moment, peace held. But peace in this land was never permanent. The Dutch had fallen to the English. The Algonquin were growing restless. And deep within Iroquois councils, voices still burned with ambition. Peace was a shallow breath, taken under duress, held between clenched teeth. The truce of 1667 may have ended open war between the French and the Iroquois, but it did not soothe the fire beneath the surface. It merely redirected it. Because while French muskets had forced a pause in one direction, the Iroquois looked elsewhere. To the west, to the Pays d'en Haut, the upper country, where scattered nations still traded, still hunted, still hoped the storm might pass them by. It would not. By the 1670s, the Iroquois Confederacy had transformed itself into something unlike anything else in the region. This was no longer a league of 5 nations defending their homelands. This was a proto-empire, a warrior society bent on strategic domination of the entire North American fur trade. It wasn't just vengeance that drove them now. It was economics. It was control. They sent war parties deep into the western Great Lakes, attacking the Miami, the Illinois, the Potawatomi, even reaching as far as the Sioux. The raids weren't random. They targeted fur-rich territories, key rivers, supply lines. Each success sent shockwaves through the continent. Villages broke apart. Bands fled south and west. The map of indigenous North America began to warp, not because of European flags, but because of Haudenosaunee steel. A single confederacy was reshaping a continent through fear. But even fear has limits. By the early 1680s, something had shifted again. Not on the battlefield, but in the minds of their enemies. Resistance had been scattered, uncoordinated, desperate. Now it was uniting. The Anishinaabe, or Ojibwe, began pushing back. So did the Illinois and the Dakota. Western tribes, long distant from the main conflict, now found common cause in survival. And increasingly they turned to the French, not as conquerors, but as allies. This was exactly what France had been waiting for. The colony could not match Iroquois numbers in open battle, but it could arm its allies. It could broker coalitions, and it could bleed the Confederacy slowly through trade embargoes, proxy wars, and shifting alliances. It became a new kind of warfare. Not raids, but politics. Not fire, but treaties, bribes, guns shipped west in secret. The Iroquois had conquered by the sword. Now they were being outflanked by the pen. Then came the hammer blow. In 1687, Governor Jacques-René de Brizay, Marquis de Denonville, launched a full-scale French expedition into Seneca country. Not a symbolic march like the one in 1666, this was a campaign of destruction. The French burned crops, destroyed villages, and captured hundreds of Iroquois, including leaders whom they shipped to France as galley slaves. It was a betrayal, a brutal one, and it backfired. The Iroquois response came the following year, in 1688. They launched a campaign that became known as the Lachine Massacre. A force of around 1,500 warriors descended on the settlement of Lachine near Montreal in a night raid that stunned the colony. Homes were torched, civilians butchered, dozens of captives taken. It was not a battle, it was a warning. And it landed like thunder. By now, France was bleeding resources on multiple fronts. European wars, colonial rivalries, rising tensions with the English. They couldn't afford endless conflict in the forests of Canada, nor could the Iroquois. Their population had dropped dramatically since the start of the century. War losses, disease, internal fracture. The very expansion that had made them powerful now stretched them too thin. They needed a new strategy, and in true Haudenosaunee fashion, they found one. In 1701, representatives of the Iroquois Confederacy travelled to Montreal. There they sat, not as subjects, not as vanquished, but as equals, with envoys from New France and over 30 other First Nations. Together, they forged the Great Peace of Montreal. It was one of the most ambitious diplomatic achievements in Indigenous history, a treaty that ended decades of bloodshed, realigned power across the Northeast, and recognised the sovereignty of the Iroquois not as enemies, but as a force to be respected. The Beaver Wars, or as they are sometimes called, the Morning Wars, were over. Not because one side annihilated the other, but because the cost had become too great. The age of fire had ended. The age of empires was beginning. And so, what did it all mean? What do we make of this century of shadow and steel? This war born of furs and frost and faith? It wasn't just about the Iroquois and the Huron. It wasn't just trade routes or raids or religious zeal. It was about the collision of worlds. The Little Ice Age had pushed nations to the brink. Disease had done what swords could not. Foreign powers had poured in, reshaping motives, drawing ancient rivalries into their orbit like moons around a gathering storm. And yet, through it all, Indigenous agency remained at the heart of the story. The Iroquois were not pawns. They were architects, warriors and diplomats, adaptable, ruthless, visionary. They shaped the land more than most kings ever did. But power always has a price. By the time the 18th century dawned, the Confederacy was a shadow of its former self, still feared, still proud, but now caught in the gravitational pull of Britain and France. Soon they would be asked to choose sides in a new war, one fought not just in forests, but on battlefields with banners and drums and red coats. And when that war came, it would not be theirs to win. But that is another fire, another tale. The story we tell here, of the Beaver Wars, of the Iroquois and the Huron, of a war born in the breath of a dying climate. It echoes still, in treaties, in trauma, in names etched into rivers and ridgelines, in the resilience of a people who refuse to vanish, and in the silence of winter mornings, when the wind moves through the trees like a memory, you can still hear it. A footstep on the snow, a whisper in Wendat, a flame refusing to die. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.